Imagine spending your entire career enforcing the law, protecting others, and dreaming of one day enjoying peace and quiet, only to find yourself in the middle of a ridiculous, escalating battle over a pair of geese. That was never part of my plan. After 32 years in law enforcement, serving as Chief Marshal of the State Police, my wife Maggie and I were ready for something quieter. We bought our forever home in Lakeview Estates, a picturesque community with rolling lawns, friendly neighbors, and, most importantly, a small pond nestled at the edge of our 2-acre property. The pond reminded me of my grandfather's farm back in Minnesota, where the sound of geese honking at dawn was as much a part of life as the smell of fresh hay. I told Maggie the day we signed the papers, "This is where I'm finally getting my geese." She just laughed and rolled her eyes. She knew I'd been talking about it for years. A month after we moved in, I visited Harold Collins's farm on the outskirts of town. Harold was a fourth-generation farmer and the kind of man who still shook hands like he meant it. He showed me his prized Chinese geese, majestic white birds with bright orange bills and a surprisingly calm presence. "These aren't the aggressive ones you hear about," he told me, "they're more like dogs if you raise them right, loyal, smart, and they'll let you know if someone doesn't belong." I brought home a pair and named them Bonnie and Clyde. Within weeks, they were more like family than livestock, following me around the yard, honking for treats, and greeting visitors with curiosity. The neighbors adored them. Frank Miller, a Vietnam vet living next door, spent hours leaning on our shared fence, watching them wander the yard. "Reminds me of home before the war," he said one evening, his voice soft and distant. The Carters' grandkids visited every weekend with handfuls of cracked corn and giggles that echoed across the lawn. Even Dorothy Hughes, the elderly widow who had lived here longer than anyone, said those birds brought a kind of peace that reminded her of simpler days. For the first time in years, I slept through the night without waking at every creak or siren. The geese, the pond, the quiet rhythm of suburban life, it was therapy. But peace, as I was about to learn, can attract the wrong kind of attention. The first time I met Karen, president of the HOA, was on an otherwise perfect Sunday morning at the community mailbox. She wore an expensive pantsuit and sunglasses so large they seemed designed to shield her from humanity itself. "You must be Thomas Walker," she said with a smile that didn't reach her eyes, handing me a crisp envelope. "Just a little something to help you understand our standards here at Lakeview." Before I could respond, she turned on her heel, her heels clicking sharply against the pavement. I opened the letter. HOA bylaw violations. Livestock not permitted. Section 8, Paragraph 4. Signed in thick blue ink, Karen, President, Lakeview Estates HOA. Beneath her signature, in bold letters, her law firm credentials gleamed like a badge. I shook my head and smiled. This wasn't my first brush with petty authority. I drafted a polite response that afternoon, explaining that Bonnie and Clyde were pets, protected under the HOA's pet provisions for non-traditional animals under 25 pounds. I thought that would be the end of it. But over the next few weeks, more letters arrived. Each colder. Each more threatening. Karen's silver Mercedes began appearing on my street daily, slowing down in front of my house, the window lowering just long enough for her phone to snap pictures before she drove off. Maggie called it neighborhood surveillance. I called it the first sign of trouble. But even then, I didn't know how far Karen would go to prove that in Lakeview Estates, the only law that mattered was hers. Spring arrived in Lakeview Estates with bright skies, warm breezes, and a sense of renewal, except at our house, where tension simmered just beneath the surface. Bonnie and Clyde had settled in beautifully, and to our delight, they soon hatched 4 healthy, fluffy goslings. My granddaughter Emily was over the moon. On her weekend visits, she named them after the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, Leonardo, Donatello, Michelangelo, and Raphael, and spent hours giggling as they waddled behind their parents. The birds were gentle and curious with familiar faces, but like any good parents, Bonnie and Clyde became more vocal when strangers came too close. It was nothing alarming, just natural protective instincts. But in Karen's world, this was all the ammunition she needed. A few days after the Goslings appeared, fluorescent orange flyers showed up on every mailbox and community board. The bold headline screamed, "Danger, aggressive attack Geese at 1842 Lakeview Drive. Keep children away. Report all incidents to HOA immediately." I found one taped to our own mailbox and could feel my pulse quicken. Maggie shook her head, muttering, "She's losing it." But Karen wasn't losing anything, she was gaining ground. Within hours, my phone started ringing with concerned neighbors asking if the rumors were true. I invited them over. Frank Miller stood in our backyard with a skeptical look on his face, until Bonnie gently pecked corn from his outstretched hand. The Carters' grandkids laughed as they sat cross-legged on the grass, goslings clambering over their knees. The so-called attack geese were nothing but family pets, and everyone could see it. Everyone except Karen. At the next HOA meeting, Karen took things to another level. She arrived late, dramatic as always, with her arm in a sling. Standing at the front of the room, she recounted, in vivid detail, how one of the geese had viciously charged her, causing her to trip and sprain her wrist. There was a collective gasp from some of her more impressionable allies, but I noticed more than a few neighbors exchanging doubtful glances. When my turn to speak came, Karen cut me off sharply. "Mr. Walker, the board has ruled. This is not up for discussion." The meeting closed with whispers and sideways glances, but Karen basked in the glow of her little performance. That night, my neighbor Martin Parker sent me a text. "Check your doorbell camera footage from this afternoon. You'll want to see this." I sat down with Maggie and pulled it up. There was Karen, standing just beyond the fence, swinging her large designer handbag at Bonnie, who flapped her wings defensively but didn't advance. Then, as if choreographed for a bad stage play, Karen clutched her wrist, dropped to the ground in slow motion, and began moaning for an audience that didn't exist. Maggie's jaw dropped. She staged the whole thing. I couldn't help but laugh, though underneath it all, I felt a spark of anger starting to kindle. But things were about to turn from petty to sinister. Early the next morning, Frank Miller came by, his face pale and tense. "Tom, you need to know something." She tried to shake me down. He explained that Karen had threatened to have his property reassessed at a higher tax rate unless he made a voluntary contribution to the HOA's discretionary fund. Frank wasn't the kind of man to be easily rattled, but the way his voice trembled told me he was deeply worried. "She's doing this to others too," he added, eyes darting toward the street. Later that week, Dorothy Hughes called, her voice shaking. "I got a notice today. She says my bird feeders are attracting pests and that if I don't take them down, she'll have the county issue a nuisance citation." I knew those feeders were Dorothy's daily connection to her late husband and the small comforts of a life she'd built here. That was the moment I realized Karen's battle wasn't just with me, it was with anyone who didn't fit her vision of control. But the worst came when I checked our front lawn security footage again, this time at Martin's suggestion. In the dead of night, two figures crept onto our property, Karen's closest allies, recognizable even in the grainy footage. They tossed something over the fence, bread soaked in red liquid. Alarmed, I inspected the yard the next morning and found chunks of bread laced with chili powder and vinegar, an attempt to provoke the geese into aggression. Fortunately, Bonnie and Clyde ignored it, but my stomach twisted at the cruelty of it. Karen was no longer just manipulative, she was dangerous. I tried to speak with Karen directly one last time, hoping to appeal to reason. She met me at the community center with her trademark thin smile and icy eyes. "Tom, you need to understand something. This neighborhood has standards. I'm the one keeping them alive. Either those birds go, or you do." Her voice was sugar-sweet, but every word dripped venom. I stared at her for a long moment, then simply said, Karen, you've made a mistake. You think you can control people through fear. But fear is fragile. She tilted her head, her smug smile faltering for just a second. Then she turned and walked away without another word. But I knew one thing for certain, she wasn't walking away for good. Karen was just gearing up for the next attack. And this time, she was going to bring every weapon she had. Saturday morning dawned bright and peaceful, the kind of day that made me grateful we'd chosen Lakeview Estates. I was out in the backyard with Emily, showing her how to feed the goslings from her open palm. Bonnie and Clyde stood watch nearby, ever attentive, while the little ones chirped and nibbled at kernels of cracked corn. Emily giggled, her eyes sparkling with joy. "Grandpa, do they ever bite?" she asked, still a little cautious. I smiled. "No teeth, sweetheart, just little ridges on their bills to help them grab food. They're gentle if you're gentle." Just as she laughed and reached out to pet Bonnie's soft feathers, I heard the sound of tires crunching on gravel. I glanced toward the driveway and felt my stomach tighten. 3 vehicles. A sheriff's cruiser with its lights flashing silently, Karen's silver Mercedes parked smugly behind it, and a white van marked County Animal Control. "Emily," I said quietly, "go inside and tell Grandma we've got visitors." She nodded and dashed toward the house. I straightened my back and waited. The young sheriff's deputy stepped out first, his posture stiff and uncertain. His nameplate read Davis. He couldn't have been older than 24, and his hand hovered too close to his holster for my liking. "Sir," he began, trying to sound authoritative, "we've received multiple reports of dangerous animals on this property. I'll need to speak to the homeowner." "That would be me," I replied evenly. "Thomas Walker." Karen emerged from her car, dressed like she was heading to a courtroom rather than a suburban driveway. Her sunglasses sat perched on her head, and the smirk on her face could curdle milk. She folded her arms and stood just behind Officer Davis, clearly savoring every second of what she believed would be my public humiliation. The animal control officer, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes, approached more cautiously, clipboard in hand. "Those attack geese have been terrorizing this neighborhood for months," Karen announced loudly, her voice ringing out across the cul-de-sac. "They're a danger to children and elderly residents alike. I've documented 17 separate incidents." Officer Davis shifted uncomfortably. "Sir, we've also received claims that these birds are being used as guard animals, security animals trained to patrol the property. Is that correct?" I held back a laugh. "No, officer. They're domestic geese, raised as pets. May I see the complaint?" He handed me a stack of papers, each more absurd than the last, allegations of geese patrolling perimeters, charging at passers-by, and responding to secret signals. I glanced up at Karen, who looked utterly confident. "Officer Davis," I said carefully, "do those birds over there look like trained attack animals to you?" I gestured toward Emily, who had returned to the porch steps and was now sitting cross-legged, surrounded by the goslings while Bonnie gently nibbled at her shoelaces. The animal control officer glanced at the scene, then back at me, her brow furrowing. Karen wasn't done. "Don't be fooled," she hissed, pointing dramatically. "He's trained them to be docile around family members, but they're dangerous. They nearly took my arm off when I tried to deliver a violation notice." The animal control officer raised an eyebrow. "Ma'am, I don't see any injuries." Karen's face flushed. I managed to escape just in time. I turned back to Officer Davis. "Would you like to see my identification, officer?" "Of course, sir," he nodded quickly. I went inside, retrieved my wallet from the kitchen counter, and returned to hand him both my driver's license and my old state police badge. His eyes widened, and his posture immediately changed. "Chief Walker, I wasn't aware." "No apology necessary, officer. You're just doing your job. I would have done the same." Karen's smug expression evaporated, replaced by confusion. What's going on? Why are you apologizing to him? The animal control officer crouched down by the pond, observing the geese calmly. These birds are in excellent health and show no signs of aggressive behavior or specialized training, she said, scribbling notes on her clipboard. In fact, they're better behaved than most animals I inspect. Karen's voice rose another octave. This is absurd. I have witnesses. They attacked me. Officer Davis cleared his throat. Ma'am, falsifying reports to law enforcement is a serious offense. Her mouth opened and closed, her eyes darting frantically between us. Do you know who I am? I was a senior partner at Pritchard & Associates. Before being asked to leave the firm for client misconduct, I added softly. Her head whipped around toward me, panic flashing across her features. How could you possibly know that? I still have friends in the legal community, Karen. When you started targeting my family, I did my homework. Officer Davis shifted his weight. Sir, would you like to file a harassment complaint? Actually, I think this goes beyond harassment. Officer, would you mind running Ms. Pritchard's name through your system? I have a feeling this pattern extends beyond my yard. Karen's composure cracked. That's completely inappropriate. I'm acting in my official capacity as HOA president. Officer Davis didn't respond. He simply walked back to his cruiser and radioed in the request. The animal control officer stood up and shook her head. I've been doing this for 20 years, and I've never seen someone weaponize wildlife allegations like this. Minutes later, Officer Davis returned, his face serious. Ms. Pritchard, are you aware there are 3 active harassment complaints against you from residents at your former address? She blanched. Those were misunderstandings. He continued. There's also a pending investigation into HOA fund misappropriation here in Lakeview Estates. Karen spun toward me, her expression a storm of fear and fury. You set this up. I just smiled. No, Karen. You did that all by yourself. By the time Karen stormed off my driveway in a whirlwind of outrage and disbelief, the neighborhood was already buzzing. Word travels fast in a community like Lakeview Estates, and within hours, phones were ringing and whispers spread like wildfire. By Sunday evening, I couldn't take 3 steps outside without a neighbor flagging me down. Some wanted to know every detail, others came simply to say, we had no idea. We thought it was just us. That was the most telling part, just us. Martin Parker called first. His voice shook with indignation as he explained how, after questioning Karen about inflated landscaping fees, he received 3 violation notices in the mail for his basketball hoop supposedly being 3 inches too tall. His grandson loved that hoop. The next call came from the Harrisons, who had dared to vote against Karen's proposal to install surveillance cameras that would face every driveway. Within days, they were slapped with citations claiming their garden gnomes violated community aesthetic standards. It wasn't enforcement. It was punishment. The most heartbreaking call came from Dorothy Hughes. Tom, she whispered, her voice thin and fragile, she threatened to put a lien on my home. Dorothy, who had lived in Lakeview Estates longer than any of us, whose bird feeders brought her comfort after her husband's passing, was now being harassed over feeding cardinals. She said I was attracting undesirable wildlife, Dorothy confessed, her voice breaking. It was never about the geese, the basketball hoops, or the gnomes. It was about control. By Monday morning, I had spoken with 23 households. Each story was worse than the last. Karen had turned the HOA into a tool for intimidation, using the rules not to protect the community but to break the spirit of anyone who stood in her way. I proposed an emergency meeting, neutral ground, at the local library, where we could speak freely without Karen silencing us or rigging the agenda. That night, more than 60 residents showed up, the largest turnout the HOA had ever seen. People who had barely exchanged polite greetings at the mailbox now sat side by side, sharing stories of harassment and fear. I didn't wear my badge or mention my former title. This wasn't about authority anymore. It was about giving the community its voice back. What we're dealing with isn't about geese or garden decorations, I told them. It's about someone twisting rules for personal gain and using fear to divide us. I let the room settle before continuing. I spent my career in law enforcement, and if there's one thing I've learned, it's that power without accountability always leads to abuse. Michael Rivera, the treasurer, stood up next, his hands trembling as he passed around copies of financial records. I started noticing discrepancies last month, he explained. When I asked Karen for clarification, she threatened to release personal information about my family, information she obtained by running background checks on every board member without authorization. Gasps echoed through the room. Running unauthorized background checks crossed a line that even Karen's staunchest supporters couldn't ignore. And then, almost on cue, the library doors swung open. Karen entered, flanked by her two remaining board allies, her face a mask of defiance. "This meeting is unauthorized," she announced, her voice sharp and commanding. "Any decisions made here are invalid under Section 12 of the bylaws." But Michael, calm and resolute, held up his copy of the same bylaws. Section 12 also states that emergency meetings can be called with 24 hours notice when issues of financial impropriety arise. Frank Miller rose slowly from his seat, his military bearing unmistakable even in his 70s. The room fell silent as he stepped forward. "I fought for this country so that tyrants couldn't control people's lives," he said, his voice steady but cold. "I didn't expect to face one in my own backyard." He turned to the room. "I motion for a vote of no confidence in the current HOA president, effective immediately." The room erupted in a chorus of ayes so overwhelming that even Karen's two remaining allies couldn't meet her eyes. The vote was unanimous. Karen stood frozen for a moment, her mouth opening as if to protest, but no words came. Her face flushed deep red, and without another word, she spun on her heel and stormed out of the library. That night, for the first time in months, the neighborhood felt lighter. The fear that had hung like a dark cloud had been lifted. But none of us knew just how deep Karen's treachery ran, not yet. What started as a community awakening was about to transform into a full reckoning. The days that followed felt like spring after a long, harsh winter. The interim board, with Frank Miller as acting president and Michael Rivera as treasurer, wasted no time commissioning a full independent audit. 3 days later, we gathered once more in the library's community room, now packed with residents eager to hear what else Karen had hidden beneath her polished smile. Lisa Brooks, the accountant brought in to conduct the review, stood before us and clicked through slide after slide of damning evidence. The $188,500 withdrawn from HOA funds for so-called community office renovations had gone straight into Karen's personal bathroom remodel, luxury fixtures, marble countertops, and custom cabinetry that no one in the neighborhood had ever approved. But the worst revelation came when Lisa read aloud an email from Karen's HOA account, titled Community Refinement Plan, sent to her sister-in-law. The document outlined a 5-year strategy to systematically drive out elderly residents, families with young children, and those she labeled undesirables, so she could reshape Lakeview Estates into an exclusive, homogeneous enclave. The room fell silent as that ugly truth hung in the air. Frank's voice was heavy with emotion as he spoke. "I've seen this kind of power grab destroy entire villages overseas. We never thought it could happen here. But it had. And it almost succeeded." The board wasted no time rewriting the bylaws with input from every resident, ensuring transparency and protection for personal expression. Bird feeders, garden gnomes, children's playgrounds, and pets like Bonnie and Clyde were now celebrated, not targeted. The geese became the heart of our community, even inspiring a spring festival where kids could meet them and learn about kindness and care. At the community entrance, a new wooden sign was placed, "Where neighbors matter more than rules." Beneath it, a smaller plaque reads, "No honking, except for geese." Karen's house sold quickly, and the irony was delicious. Her real estate agent highlighted the community's friendly pond geese as a selling point. Last I heard, she moved into a strict high-rise condo with a no-pet policy, where she promptly filed a complaint about a neighbor's service dog. Some people never change. As for me, I officially retired last year. These days, my only authority is over my 6 grandkids and 12 geese. Neither group listens much, but both remind me daily what matters most. True security doesn't come from enforcement or control. It comes from community, trust, and neighbors who refuse to be silent in the face of bullying. We learned that lesson the hard way, but we came out stronger for it. And every time I hear the geese honk by the pond at sunset, I smile, knowing they weren't just birds, they were the start of something bigger. Have you ever felt powerless against HOA or Karen rules? Share your experiences below. Let's see who had it worse.